All right, so as we continue on in our discussion of the executive branch, and particularly in this case, the administrative part of the executive branch, what we call the federal bureaucracy, we'll talk about a set of theories. A theory first that bureaucracies are all powerful, that's known as bureaucratic theory, and then a theory that states, well, that's just not true, which is called the theory of the captured bureaucracy. So we start with the premise and then we just prove it because that's a nice, neat way to do things. So let's talk about something called bureaucratic theory. As I open a delicious Diet Coke because I'll let you behind the curtain here. It's like 80 something degrees in my room right now because it's summertime and it's hotter than hell. Anyways, so bureaucratic theory dates back a couple centuries to a gentleman by the name of Max Weber. Now, Max Weber, if he were here today, which would be kind of gross because he'd be like 200 years old and he'd look like crap, would argue to you, if you want to know what's going on in a school, you don't go to the principal. Now, that's not throwing shade at our principal at the moment. It's more a statement of that true organizational power, and I don't know why I say organizational like a Canadian hockey player, but I do. True organizational power does not exist at the top of the pyramid. Weber's argument was, quite simply, that if you're at the top of the pyramid, you have such a myriad of responsibilities, that means a lot for those of you who are not into vocabulary, that at the end of the day, they can't possibly know everything that's going on. They've got too big a job description. They're at the top of the pyramid, which means they're fairly far removed from the day-to-day operations of the school, the company, the business, the country. And so their day-to-day explicit knowledge of the situation is limited. And again, not throwing shade at any presidents or governors or anything of that description, just saying that that's what Weber argued. Weber argued, if you really want to know what's going on in a school, you ask the secretaries. You really want to know what's going on in a country, you ask the staff, you ask the bureaucracy. Same would be true at the state level, by the way. I'm not implying governors are somehow more knowledgeable than presidents. I'm saying Weber would argue that the people down at the staff level, you want to go into a company, don't talk to the CEO, talk to one of the people who's kind of a mid-manager type. They're not in charge, of course. Their name isn't on the masthead. They're not in the C-suite. They're not the ones that get elected. But the argument is they have two things working for them. Number one is that they have control of information. Now, they have control of information for two different reasons. Reason number one is their specialization. So we went through the nuts and bolts of bureaucracy in a previous lecture. So we know there's like 15 cabinet departments and dozens upon dozens of agencies that serve underneath them and all that good stuff. Okay, well, if you're in the Pentagon, right, serving in the Department of Defense, and you are at the desk, as they call it, it's not one desk, of course, it's like one area. If you're at the desk that deals with Middle Eastern affairs, then I guarantee you, as sure as I'm sitting here right now, that you are going to know more about the conflict in Gaza than the president does. And again, not a shot at the president. You are going to know more because that's all you do, right? I teach history and government. So I'm going to go on a limb and say that I know more about history and government than your math teacher does. And I am quite certain that they know more about calculus than I do. My AP score would affirm that, actually. So that's the nature of specialization. Well, one of the things we know is that Congress tries to specialize by using committees. We talked about that previous. But presidents really don't have the capacity to specialize because there's only one president, right? So that's item one as to why the bureaucracies would run the government, because they have the ability to command information because they specialize. The logic being that if the president wants to make an informed decision about the Middle East or about the Ukraine or about China, he is likely to, or his chief of staff is likely to, go to the person in the bureaucracy responsible for that area of policy and say, give me the information. Tell me what you know. Okay? But that's not all. You see, there's a second reason why Weber argued that the bureaucracy is paramount in the decision-making process, and that is that unlike political officials, bureaucracies have a permanency, and members of the bureaucracy often have a permanency that their leaders lack. And by the way, that is absolutely true everywhere else. There is a middle manager right now at McDonald's Corporation that has been there since hamburgers were 25 damn cents, and CEOs come and go all the time. Right? Again, I am not, disclaimer, I am not insulting anyone in particular. But in the 20 some god number years that I've been teaching, I've gone through 11 principals, 10? I don't know. I kind of lost count, I'm not going to lie. But there are secretaries in the office that have been there the entire time I've taught. In fact, until a couple years ago, there were a couple secretaries here that were here when I was a student. And you've seen the gray in the beard, not a young man. So the idea, and by the way, that applies at the federal level as well. There are people who work in the Department of Defense, staff members, staff, managers that have been there not just for the current president, but for the one before him, the one before him, the one before him, dating back to, Reagan and Clinton and Bush, the first Bush. Okay, people who've been in the Pentagon since I was a student at Maricosta High School. So obviously, if you do something for a long time, you build muscle memory, the brain's a muscle, you're going to retain a lot of information. You become kind of a walking encyclopedia on that subject. So Weber takes all this and says, this is why they're all, not all powerful, they're not omnipotent, but this is why the bureaucracies hold a position of particular power and authority, even though their station, if you will, their status would not seem to imply it. So is that true as it relates to American government? Not really. Kinda. Certainly, their control of information is valuable. Certainly, their ability to serve multiple administrations allows them to build up expertise. On those counts, Weber's not wrong. But the bottom line is that there's still instruments of control at all levels of government that keep the bureaucracy in a servile position. So let's take a look at those. Starting with an obvious one, which is the president. The president is the head of the executive branch. The bureaucracy works for the executive branch. There you go, right? He is technically their boss. Now, yes, he is reliant on them for policy knowledge. Yes, he is reliant on them to execute the initiatives that he has helped either craft with Congress or crafted via executive order or what have you. Obviously, the Department of Defense is going to execute whatever war initiatives the president might come up with or military initiatives the president might come up with. Those are all true. However, the president is not in a position where he is subservient to the bureaucracy and, sitting there like a cipher saying, oh, well, please, loyal bureaucrat, tell me what I should think. So let's look at those instruments of control, or instruments of capture, to use the phrase that political scientists use. The first is appointment power. In the Constitution, one of the, not very many, but one of the explicit powers that the President of the United States has is the power to appoint high-ranking officials in all government agencies, not just the courts. Especially given recent years, we fixate on the courts, that's understandable, but really where this takes off is on all other levels of the administrative branch of government. He picks every cabinet official. He picks every director of every major agency, right? Well, let's say I get elected president someday. By the way, I won't, and even if I did, I won't. Make it easy on ourselves. If I somehow manage it, move. Trust me, it's in your best interest. But obviously, and this is not giving away a state secret, I am very much an ally of the LGBTQ community. I have children that are LGBTQ. So obviously, I am not going to appoint an attorney general who is going to push a lot of anti-gay and anti-trans legislation or a lot of anti-gay and anti-trans initiatives. That person would simply never get a job with me, right? And if I'm a tree-hugging, Prius-driving environmentalist, I am one of those three things. I consider myself a bit of an environmentalist, or at least a conservationist. I do not drive Priuses. I've driven them as rentals. I hate them. No pickup at all. And hugging trees is painful, so I try to avoid that at all costs. I would obviously put someone in charge of the Interior Department, which handles all federal lands, who was also an environmentalist. Just to give you a perspective of what I mean by that, in 2017, President Trump, upon being elected, President Trump, not an environmentalist nor a tree hugger, and I can't imagine driving a Prius. I can't imagine him driving, to be honest with you. Most high-ranking political and business people don't. He appoints as his head of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, a key regulatory bureaucracy. He appoints a guy named Scott Pruitt. Now, Scott Pruitt is not a name anybody here probably knows unless he's a distant uncle, and if he is, I feel bad because I'm about to throw some major shade on him. Scott Pruitt was the Attorney General of the state of Oklahoma. You're like, okay, well, he's a lawyer. That makes sense as EPA, sure. It's what he did before that that is relevant. He was the chief counsel for an oil company. So I think you could probably guess how he handled environmental affairs, right? Kind of goes without saying. So the appointment power is an opportunity for the president to make sure that a bureaucracy runs according to his or her vision. Based on the fact that you're going to put people in charge who are going to direct that agency who are not going to deviate from your goals as president. Second thing is budgetary influence. Now, the president does not have, as we know from our branch studies that we've done earlier, president does not have a ton of budgetary influence, right? Ultimately, he has two powers. Well, three. The first is actually coming up here, and I realize I left an end quote out there, and that's going to annoy me for the rest of this lecture. Going public. The president has the ability to try to persuade the public, and he has a very big microphone being president of the United States, to either advance certain causes or inhibit certain causes, right? We'll get to that in a minute when we talk about going public. The second and primary power the president has is when Congress passes the budget, the appropriations bills, he signs them or vetoes them. That's the main power the president has. But a third power he has that is an informal power, but not an unimportant one, is at the beginning of the process, the president often will release what is known as a draft budget. Often alluded to in his State of the Union address, actually. A draft budget has no formal authority whatsoever, okay? The Congress can take it, they can ignore it, they can, make paper airplanes out of it, doesn't matter, right? But it is an important symbolic gesture. It's the president's way of saying, this is what my priorities are. And Congress, who, as we know, is usually less popular than even the president, I would like you to follow these initiatives. Now, if the president retains a lot of popularity, that thing carries a lot of weight. But even if it doesn't, it at least opens up a debate. So if the president wants to reward a bureaucracy that he thinks their mission is important, like Kennedy with all the space agencies in the 1960s, for example, then you call for, in your draft budget, increases in that budget. Of course, the converse is also true, and that lets me tell you one of my favorite political stories ever. Happened in the late 1980s, maybe it was the early 90s. I think it was the late 80s. And it happened over a very, very small government agency called the NEA, National Endowment for the Arts. Small agency in the scope of the entire federal budget, tiny budget. But its job was, it took the few $1 million it had. I don't remember what the exact budget was, but it was not a ton. It was under $100 million. And we're talking a multi-trillion-dollar budget, so under $100 million. I know it sounds like a lot, and certainly if you have $100 million to share with me, I'll gladly accept. But in the course of the federal budget, it's not a whole lot. So the NEA came into the target of conservative media outlets in the late 80s, early 90s for a couple of projects that they underwrote. That is to say that they helped fund. by either funding, paying for galleries to put these things up, or by actually paying the artist to produce, which is the two ways you can underwrite art. One of them was a piece of physical art, like a mobile or something like that, called Piss Christ. And I cannot remember the name of the artist. He was a young Latino man. He was a Reformed Catholic, or a lapsed Catholic would be the better term. And so he decided to express his discontent with the Catholic Church by creating this piece of art called Piss Christ. Piss Christ consisted of a chemistry beaker, a crucifix, and several ounces of human urine. You could probably figure out the assembly for this particular piece of art. Beaker, pee goes in beaker, crucifix gets slam dunked into the pee, and you can also probably imagine how unlapsed Catholics felt about that. They were not pleased. But that was actually the second most controversial project. The most controversial project was one called the Mapplethorpe exhibit, named for the photographer who created it, a guy by the name of Robert Mapplethorpe. I've actually, just not very long ago, earlier in this summer, saw some of Mapplethorpe's work as part of a larger exhibit on modern art at MoMA in New York, Museum of Modern Art. This was not the most controversial stuff that I saw. Controversial stuff was, I think we have to call it what it was, and it was on display, I want to say, at the Cincinnati Museum of Art, which, by the way, is housed in this beautiful old train station. If, I'm prone to travel tips for y'all. If you happen to be in the Cincinnati area, there are 3 museums in the complex with the train station. It is worth a trip. It's beautiful. This exhibit, by the way, long gone. If this exhibit worries you or offends you, long gone. This was, again, 30, maybe over 30 years ago. So anyhow, I think we have to call the Mapplethorpe exhibit what it was. It was basically gay S&M photographs. The most controversial of which was a nude man with a bullwhip lodged in a place I cannot imagine a bullwhip could comfortably be ensconced. This got the attention of not just conservative media, but members of Congress and the President of the United States at the time, George H.W. Bush, the father of George W. Bush. Because people were wondering, and this is a reasonable question, why the government was paying money for someone to take a picture of a dude with a bullwhip in his butt. Fair question. So when he issued his next draft budget at the State of the Union, the NEA had $0.00. He zeroed out their budget, knowing he'd get asked about it, and he did. And his response was something to the effect of, if this is how the government is going to spend, if this is how the NEA is going to spend the people's money, then they're going to get none of the people's money to spend. That is using budgetary influence. That also is an example of numero 30 on there, which is going public. One way for the president to arouse the attention of the people towards the acts of a bureaucracy, for good or for ill, is by publicly speaking on them. Because the President of the United States is the one political figure in the country that every time that they speak, people pay attention. Okay? The President of the United States is the only political figure in America who can go to the networks and say, I need an hour of time on Sunday evening at 10 p.m. and more than likely get it, right? So the best way I ever heard it described was on an old TV show, and it pains me to say it was an old TV show because it both started and ended in my adulthood, a show called The West Wing. It was a political drama about 25, 30 years ago. Starred 25 years ago. Starred Martin Sheen and Rob Lowe and Allison Janney and a few others. Really, John Spencer, an amazing role as his chief of staff. R.I.P. He's been gone about 15 years now. The president, who's played by Martin Sheen in the show, is chastising a donor of his who wants him to go public on something, and he uses a great saying. He says, Ted, that was the name of the guy he's talking to, I'm a human starter's pistol. I've always, and now, again, 25 years ago probably, I've always loved that characterization. I am a human starter's pistol, because when the president decides to fixate on a subject, it's going to become a topic. That's the power of going public. Last but not least, reorganization of agencies. Now, can't do this without Congress, but to be truthful, you can't do a few of these things without Congress, as we'll get to in a second. But the president can use the power of budgetary influence, the power of going public, to go to Congress and say, hey, we need to completely reorganize this agency. President George W. Bush did that after 9/11. He did that with creating the Department of Homeland Security, taking different agencies from different authorities and putting them under one umbrella. Because we may forget this, but counterterrorism was part of the FBI, part of the Justice Department. Meanwhile, the Secret Service was actually part of the Treasury Department. A lot of people forget that. The original purpose of the Secret Service was to go after counterfeiters during the Civil War. It didn't get protection on its agenda till 1901 when McKinley got shot. And the powers that be realized that, that's the third president's been shot in 36 years. We might have to have a better way of handling that particular topic. And they moved Social Security to also be a protection agency. So take Secret Service out of Treasury, put them in Homeland Security. Take FBI counterterrorism and intelligence and put it under there. And so you move all these agencies around. Create the Transportation Safety Authority, the people who do all the security when you go through airports. Put them under that umbrella. You could do that, but again, you're going to need the help of Congress. But as I said, a lot of this requires the help of Congress, so let's go there. So, the power of Congress, the first primary power of Congress is what's called the power to advise and consent. That's what the Constitution calls it. The power of advise and consent. The power of what we call confirmation. So yes, if we go back to the presidential slide, and I'm not going to because it was up for 15 minutes. Just rewind, damn it. The president has the power to appoint people to lead these bureaucracies. But they don't actually get to lead those bureaucracies unless the United States Senate, and it is explicitly the Senate, confirms that nomination. Now, here's the thing. More often than not, they will. For sure. More often than not, they will. The president does get a certain degree of deference. Less than they used to, for sure. But what the Senate can do is they can avoid some ideologically scary picks by going to the president and saying, look, Mr. President, yeah, if you appoint them, they're not going to be confirmed. We tell you that in advance. Here's a sneak preview. You appoint this individual, they're not getting confirmed. How about these people instead? And if the president's smart, getting embarrassed by the Senate is not something you want on your agenda very often, the president will listen. So there is some both implicit and explicit power in the power of confirmation. The implicit power is the president knows that the Senate has that power and may adjust his or her appointments accordingly. The explicit power is they can refuse people, and they have. The Democratic Senate, was it 2007, I think it was? President Bush lost his attorney general, wanted another one, and the Senate refused to confirm him, saying he was too ideologically extreme. So that can be done. But the big power is number 2, and that's appropriations. And the reason why is because the federal government's budget is huge. We've talked about that. Because it's so huge, there are very few government agencies or programs, very few, that take up a reasonable part of the federal budget. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds here, but work with me, okay? The president has the veto power. We know this. But what the president does not have is something that has long been referred to as a line item veto. Line like line on the ground, item like item at the grocery store. Line item veto. Line item veto is a veto that some state governors have, which allows them to veto part of a bill but accept the rest. Like, hey, here's the budget. I don't like this $300 million for this new weapon system, but everything else is cool. Got it? Got it. Well, our president does not have that. It was ruled unconstitutional. He was briefly given it, and it was ruled unconstitutional in a court case probably 30 years ago now. 25 maybe. So, the president's in a position when he gets the federal budget, he either has to accept the whole thing or veto the whole thing. So if Congress is opposite to the president, which as we know from our discussions in this unit, is more and more common these days, then they can throw a shot at a bureaucracy that they don't like by cutting the budget. Not completely, but just cut it by a third. Cut it by 20%, 10%, doesn't matter. Just enough to make it harder for that agency that you don't like to do their job. here is why. Because when you do that, it makes that bureaucracy less effective. It opens you up to come back and cut it by a similar percentage the next year. And the president is highly unlikely to veto the entire $3 or $4 trillion, whatever it is. I think it's actually up closer to $5 now, federal budget, because you cut one agency by 25%. And there's precedent for this. President Clinton, back in the 90s, created this organization. Some of my friends were in it. That was called AmeriCorps. AmeriCorps was like a Peace Corps, but not for going overseas and doing diplomatic or charitable stuff. It was a domestic version of that. People were paid money to go teach in the inner city where there was a lot of teacher shortages. They were paid money to, if you were a doctor, instead of going to some high-powered medical clinic or hospital, to go work at a underfunded, understaffed clinic in a rural area in the South, things like that. Well, when the new Republican Congress came in the mid-90s, they hated Clinton, and they hated this, and it was his signature, domestic policy. It was his Great Society-esque thing, right? So they started to cut the budget. 10% here, 20% here, 18% here, whatever. Year by year, they just cut till the organization basically ceased to exist. And Clinton could never veto it because he's not going to cut the entire federal budget, the entirety of defense spending, the entirety of Social Security funding for this 200, 300, 400, whatever it was, $1 million program. So appropriations is a powerful weapon. So is the power of executive oversight. Saw a little bit of this, although it was done, even I think some of their supporters admitted very sloppily, by the Republican House of Representatives on President Joe Biden. Going after the president, going after the agencies that he runs. So the power of executive oversight, as an airplane goes overhead, don't know if you could hear that or not, is that agencies may change their behavior if they think they're going to be, curtailed by Congress. When the whole Mapplethorpe and NEA thing happened, the head of the NEA was called before the United States Senate, and it was a difficult discussion. It was a grilling on national television. More recently, Alejandro Mayorkas, the head of Department of Homeland Security, has been called before the House of Representatives on the immigration issue and grilled on national television. That dude was fodder for Fox News for a solid week. So it can be embarrassing, but it could also lead to, okay, because we held these hearings and did not get sufficient answers, we can now go back and play with the appropriations. We can now go back and impeach, because those high-ranking government bureaucratic officials, cabinet secretaries, can be impeached. They're subject to it. So, now granted, there's no precedent for it. It hasn't happened, but it could. Or it hasn't happened in 150 years. Last but not least, and then we'll call it a day. How the Supreme Court can capture bureaucracy is simple. Judicial review. It's the one power that the Supreme Court has over the executive branch, but it is a damned bazooka aimed at the executive branch. Because, of course, the Supreme Court can say, yeah, this law that you guys have been executing, not constitutional. You can't do this. Therefore, the bureaucracies created by that law cannot exist. The most famous example of this, of course, was back in the 1930s in the New Deal, which led to the whole court packing thing for those of you who have fond memories of APUSH, right? To review, for those of you who do not have fond memories of APUSH, or worse yet, wasted your time in summer school and shame shall be visited upon your families forever for that. You tell how I feel about the summer school, right? And if you took it online, I can't even talk to you. Can't do it. But the President, Roosevelt, had created a raft of government agencies in the wake of the Depression, as he had promised to do. The country calls for action and action now and all that. Well, in 1935 and in 1936, the Supreme Court nixed two of the biggest laws, reform laws, that Roosevelt had passed in the first New Deal. the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which had created two major agencies, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration and the National Recovery Administration. So they effectively ruled that these two regulatory agencies that had been created to help alleviate the Depression had overstepped the bounds of Congress and the president in terms of what could be done to regulate commerce. The Commerce Clause of the first article, the congressional article, right? So, how'd that happen? Well, the answer is real simple. The court, Congress may have been overwhelmingly Democratic at that point. Certainly, Roosevelt was an avid Democrat. But see, here's the thing. The court was not. The court was almost entirely appointed by Republican presidents. And the few that weren't were appointed by Woodrow Wilson, who was nobody's idea of a stalwart liberal. So they were all, it was a very conservative court, probably 6'3" or 7'2" even, maybe 6'3", very similar to now, actually, right? Now, as I record this, which is July of 2024. So the court had a very pro-business approach, even if Roosevelt and Congress wanted to put the brakes on business to try to promote certain reforms that they thought would alleviate the Depression. So the Supreme Court says those laws are unconstitutional. Famously, in 1937, coming off a landslide victory, Roosevelt ponders adding 6 justices to the Supreme Court to raise it to 15, which would give him a 9-6 majority on the court. Because, of course, he'd get to appoint all 6. An overwhelmingly Democratic Senate, I think it was 79-17 in the Senate at that point, or something in that line, would approve whoever he picked, and you'd be off to the races, right? Never happened. Even a pro-Roosevelt, pro-Democratic Congress was like, boy, we're not sure about this, and the plan ultimately went nowhere. But the court, couple justices switched on upholding the Social Security Act, and the net result of that was, and then 2 justices retired, and Roosevelt was able to change the court anyway without that intervention. But what that underscores is that the Supreme Court does have a way of capturing a bureaucracy. They could very simply step in and say, the things this bureaucracy are doing are based off a law that is unconstitutional. We've seen a little bit of that in the modern era, looking at the abilities of the national, the education, the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, the Federal Election Commission to regulate campaign finance. The famous, infamous, if you're opposed to it, Citizens United case was built entirely around that subject. So, we know that the court can do these things. We know what the Congress can do. We know what the president can do. So every branch has at least one instrument of control over the bureaucracy. So yes, they retain this amazing amount of knowledge. Yes, they have the ability to build on that base of knowledge with years and years and years of faithful service, but that does not make them omnipotent, and that ultimately is the bottom line. All right, that pretty much closes the book on bureaucracy. We're heading to the judicial branch here in short order. Have a wonderful afternoon, evening, or morning, whenever the hell it is you're hearing this. And I will talk to you guys down the line.